Okay, so welcome everybody. I'm happy that we are able to continue our session of Q&As. This week, we have a special guest. I'm going to turn over the floor to our member, Bill Hurd, who has been friends with this particular guest for a long time. So, Bill, maybe you can give us a brief introduction to Steve.
Sure, thank you, Vince. I'm very pleased to introduce my longtime friend, Steve Kemper. I've known Steve since he was a PhD candidate at the University of Connecticut. He earned his doctorate in American literature at UConn in 1980. Steve and his wife, Jude, live in West Hartford, Connecticut. They have 2 adult children. Steve will discuss his latest book, Our Man in Tokyo, An American Ambassador and the Countdown to Pearl Harbor. Steve will give us an insightful, extensively researched view of Ambassador Joseph Grew and his fraught relationships with the Japanese government and with our own State Department. Following graduation from UConn, Steve worked as a freelance journalist. He's written for the Smithsonian, National Geographic, Wall Street Journal, and many other publications. Steve also is the author of 4 books. These include Code Name Ginger, the story behind Segway and Dean Kamen's quest to invent a new world. It's an inside look at the invention of that personal transportation device. A Labyrinth of Kingdoms, 10,000 miles through Islamic Africa, traces Heinrich Barth's 1850 expedition across Africa as he searches for Timbuktu, the city of gold. And A Splendid Savage, the restless life of Frederick Russell Burnham. Burnham was a scout for the British during the Boer War. His life and skills at woodcraft helped inspire his friend, Lord Baden-Powell, to found the Boy Scouts. And now, Our Man in Tokyo. In Steve's book, I learned about the bitter internecine battles among Japanese diplomats, the Navy, the Army senior and junior officers, and even the Emperor, and how these confrontations eventually led to war. This, among other interesting facts, is what Steve will bring to us today. So please welcome our speaker, Steve Kemper. Steve?
Thanks, Bill. I know a lot of you probably are familiar with the rise of Nazism, fascism in Europe in the 1930s. Everybody knows about Hitler and Mussolini, Kristallnacht, the extermination trains, the brown shirts. But if you're like me, before I started researching this book, you know a whole lot less about Japan during the same time period. For most Americans, I think, our knowledge about Japan in this era starts with those stark images of ships sinking into Pearl Harbor, smoking and sinking. And my book is about how we got to those stark images, what happened to get us there. The man who knew the most about Japan at the time, who did everything in his power to avert or slow down this slide towards war, was our ambassador to Japan for 10 years before Pearl Harbor. His name is Joseph Grew. He was there for 10 years, and he was there when the bombs dropped. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Joseph Grew, who he was, what he tried to do, and also give you some background about Japan, because it's so interesting and was surprising to me and maybe surprising to you. That's Joe Grew right there. Someone mentioned that he looks like an ambassador straight out of Central Casting. He's handsome, athletic, over 6 foot tall. He grew up a posh life in Boston on Beacon Hill. Boston Brahmins were his parents. He went to Groton, and then, like his father and his brothers and every other Grew before him, he was foreordained to go to Harvard. He did that, and when he got out, he was supposed to go into Boston business or banking, also foreordained for the Grew males, but instead he told his father, "That idea bores me to death. I want adventure." His father was appalled, said, "You can go on a wingding around the world for 1 year, and then you'll come back and you'll settle down in Boston. You'll do what the Grews do." So instead of going to London, Paris, the usual places you might expect a young man to go, Grew took off for the Far East. He hunted big game, climbed mountains, caught malaria in the jungles, Southeast Asia, visited China, visited Japan. And when he got back after a year, he gave his father the bad news. He was certain he didn't want to go onto State Street. He wanted to go into the State Department. And that's what he did. So he decided, instead of living this fairly easy a predictable life as a Boston Brahmin. He wanted to serve his country in foreign lands, and that's what he did. He served in 14 posts during his career, all over the world. Cairo, Mexico City, Vienna, Berlin. He was in Berlin, helped to close that embassy down during World War I. Came back to the State Department in the 1920s and helped usher in the professionalization of the Foreign Service. It had always been just a patronage service before. You had to be rich, you had to know somebody rich, and you didn't expect to do much work when you got the job as ambassador. Grew hated that, and he wanted to see it become a professional occupation that would attract people who wanted to devote their lives to this. So he helped to make that happen. Of course, patronage didn't go away, to his regret, but we did get a professional service of diplomats, consular officers, and so on. He became ambassador to Denmark, then to Switzerland, and then finally to Turkey. And that's where he was, pardon me, in 1932, when he got the call from President Herbert Hoover to please accept the ambassadorship to the most troublesome spot on the globe at the time, Japan. Why was it troubling? Well, in 1931, the Japanese army had invaded and occupied Manchuria, a Chinese province, and they had done so without seeking permission from the civilian government of Japan. So Hoover was a little concerned that this looked like the military was getting a little bit off the leash over there. So he sent our best diplomat to see if he could do anything to blunt this, to change their minds, bring them back towards the West. What was going on there? Well, it was mayhem. I was really surprised to read about what Japan was like in the early and late middle 1930s. There were coup attempts, there were plots, there were all kinds of conspiracies. There were right-wing so-called patriotic societies, which were on the rise. Membership was swelling. These patriotic societies included members of the police, the military, politicians, and they were espousing a nativistic, nationalistic return to the old ways of Japan, make Japan great again, go back to the old values. One of those old values included worship of the emperor. This is the headline that Grew saw on his way to Japan. It sort of told him what he was in for. He was traveling across the country. And this is a headline he saw in Chicago. Some naval officers, young naval officers, assassinated the prime minister right before Grew got there. Grew was on the kill list too, but he hadn't yet arrived, so he survived it. The prime minister did not. That's the sort of thing he was stepping into. It was a lot of turmoil, political turmoil, resentment building up, people making factions within Japan. What's interesting about Japan, one of the things that's interesting about this is that, unlike in Germany, for instance, where you always had left-wing people, liberal people, whatever you want to call them, trying to plot the assassination of Hitler and other high Nazi officials, in Japan, the plots always came from the right wing. The young soldiers, the young patriotic society people, they were always trying to get, they were always upset with how liberal the government was. They weren't right-wing enough. We need to get rid of these people so we can really swing to the right. It's a very odd difference between the two countries during the 1930s. One of the things that Grew had to figure out right away were the levers of power. Who does he need to talk to try to convince the Japanese leadership to change their foreign policy, not to go off the deep end, to control the army? And that starts with understanding the place of the emperor in Japanese society. This is Emperor Hirohito. He's 31 at the time that Grew arrived. He's a shy man, bookish. He likes to spend his time studying marine organisms in his lab. Yet he's considered by the Japanese to be a god, literally a god. He's the descendant of the first emperor who came down from the sun goddess 2,600 years previously. And in a continuous, unbroken line of divinity, we get Hirohito. The problem with this story is that it was only 100 years old, but The Japanese believed it, absolutely. And their country and everything was based around worship of this divinity. Now, the problem with the divinity is that if you're a god, you can't make mistakes. And so if you can't make mistakes, you can't make decisions, because we all know when we make decisions, we know where that sometimes goes. Well, Hirohito was the head of state, the commander-in-chief, and the spiritual leader, but he was not allowed to make any decisions, because if he made a mistake, that would prove he was fallible and human, and therefore not a god, and therefore the whole thing comes crumbling down. So and yet you can, if he's the head of state and the commander-in-chief, you can see how this could lead to some problems, and that's exactly what happened. They also had let me go back. They had a parliamentary type of democracy at this point. So they have him, Hirohito, he's the head of state, commander-in-chief, but they also have a parliamentary democracy with a diet, which is their parliament, a prime minister and ministers and so on. The prime minister is not chosen by the parties. It's not chosen by the people. It's chosen not by the emperor. It's chosen by the emperor's major advisors, called the genro, retired statesmen, palace. They pick who's prime minister. Hirohito rubber stamps it, and that's how you get your next prime minister. The prime minister appoints the ministers, of course, except for the minister of war, which is the army, and the minister of the navy. The army and the navy get to appoint those prime ministers. So the problem with this is that since the military considers itself beholden only to the emperor, they're outside of the civil government because their commander-in-chief is the emperor. That allows the army and the navy, the military, to essentially say whatever we do, it's for the good of the emperor and the good of the nation, because those two things are the same. And this is going to lead to huge problems. So if they don't like, for instance, where the prime minister is taking Japan, or if they don't like the foreign policies of the foreign minister, the minister of war or the minister of the navy can resign and cause the cabinet to fall. They fell a lot. Guru had to deal with 17 different prime ministers in his 10 years. Pardon me, and 10 prime ministers. It's political chaos. Okay, so this part of this complicated mess. You have this ancient idea of the divine emperor and this overlay of a modern government, and that reflects the tremendous cultural change that Japan had gone through in less than 100 years. You probably know, everybody's heard about Commodore Matthew Perry. He opened Japan in 1853. Japan had been isolated from the world. Nobody was allowed in. There had been a feudal society run by shoguns. It was very hierarchical. The West came in there. Suddenly, Japan opens up, and they start adapting wholesale from the West, systems of government, systems of education, business practices, industrialization, military organization. The top military army officers often got their training in Berlin. The top naval officers in Japan often got further training at the Royal Academy of the Navy in Britain, or at our academy here in the United States. Japan's leaders often sent their sons to colleges in Britain or the United States. There was a tremendous overlap of cultural interests, business interests between the United States and Britain in particular, and Japan. Yet underneath it, you had this ancient traditional culture with the geishas were still very important in Japanese society when Guru got there. So was kabuki theater, which is thousands of years old. So was the samurai warrior and the code of the Bushido. That was very important for the military. And yet, on the other hand, you have Western fashions, such as these two fashionistas. I like this guy on the right here. He's got a kimono on with a straw boater on top. You saw that all the time in Tokyo. Here's another one that illustrates it perfectly. Western fashions and old traditional Japanese fashion. The Japanese loved American movies. There's Cary Grant up there and Jean Harlow. And I don't know if you can see Mickey Mouse. I can't use a pointer, but see him right. Is that coming through when I do that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, there's Mickey Mouse. American movie stars were huge. American movies were huge. American restaurants, American music was very popular. There were a lot of jazz clubs, nightclubs, dance clubs that did Western dances. Movie stars were on the cover of Japanese magazines. They imported a lot of things from the West, including, for instance, baseball. They became baseball fanatics. This is a picture of Gru catching the first pitch from Japan's Minister of Education. This guy practiced, they said, for 2 weeks beforehand. He's wearing swallowtail coat with cuffs and the whole get up. And Gru had to leap all of his 6'1" and leap up to nab this pitch because the guy was not very good. Why were they there? What was the first pitch of what? Well, it was the Imperial University were playing exhibition games against Harvard University's baseball team. Why would Harvard go to Japan? Because there were so many Harvard alumni living in Tokyo, Japanese alumni. Gru noted that the Japanese never said nasty things to the umpire, made a big difference between Americans and them. Another big very popular import was golf. Japan took to golf just like Americans did. Gru was an avid golfer. He liked to play twice a week. It said it kept him sane while everything was going insane around him. This is a photo of him with Babe Ruth and Lefty O'Doul and a Japanese professional. American baseball was so popular that Ruth was paid, and O'Doul, men like him, were paid a tremendous amount of money to come to Japan to play 17 exhibition games against Japan's first professional team, the Giants. And the games were sold out, 60,000 people per game. Ruth was bombed with confetti on the Ginza, people shouting "Banzai Babe." He had massive homers. They crushed them in every game. The Americans did. Ruth said later, they're good little ball players, but they can't hit the old onion. But that just gives you some sense of how popular many American things were there. This was another highlight of 1934, I believe this was, the Marcus Review, American style entertainments, live entertainments. This thing was there for 6 weeks, 2 shows daily, sold out every time. By the end of 6 weeks, the impresario wanted to extend the run, and this is where the story is going to start to twist a little. The Japanese Home Ministry said, no, we're getting too much pressure. This is a Western extravagance, decadent extravagance, and you must leave the country. Meanwhile, Gru is living the life of an ambassador, trying to do what he does. I just thought you might be interested in seeing this. This is the Chancery, where the offices of the embassy are. These 2 buildings flanking it are residential apartments for embassy staff. This is Gru's residence in the same compound, very nice palatial place, which he used for entertainment. Ambassadors were expected to entertain lavishly, and that included paying for all the liquor themselves, because of course we had prohibition in the US at the time, and besides there was no budget for it in the State Department. Gru did provide lots of alcohol to his guests. He thought it was a social lubricant. He wanted people talking. That's how an ambassador gets information that might be useful to his government. And unlike unlike all of the other embassies in Tokyo, almost most of the time, half of the guests at Gru's soirees, luncheons, dinners, events were Japanese. The other embassies tended not to invite any Japanese, which puzzled Gru very much. How are you going to get information that you need if you're not cultivating social contacts? And he was very good at that. By 1934, he had improved relations enough and had become well enough known for doing so that he made the cover of Time magazine. The Japanese liked him. He was interested in their point of view. He wanted to understand them and be understood. He called himself an interpreter between cultures. And he was sincere about that. He thought that was the way you needed to be if you wanted to get anything done in a foreign country.
Okay. On my phone.
Pardon?
Let me remind everybody to go ahead and mute yourselves so that you don't talk into the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, you remember,
I
I
don't
mentioned,
understand if somebody else is on.
yeah, there's somebody named there. I think you just muted. Good. I see the mute sign on Cole now. The ambassador, I mentioned earlier that the prime minister had been assassinated as Gru was on his way to Japan, and the trial began. And at first, the Japanese public was appalled because these were seditionists and murderers. And that's the way the public thought of them. But then they were allowed to talk as long as they wanted to during their trial. It became a show trial that showed off what they considered Japanese patriotism. They said that that's the reason that they had to kill the prime minister, because the prime minister was opposing the expansion of the imperial empire, and that was against the emperor's best interest and Japan's best interest, so he had to go. By the time the trial ended, the Japanese public, with the help of the jingoistic press, which was now starting to be controlled mostly by the military and the right wing, had completely switched the public's opinion. These guys were now considered patriots. They should not be punished. They should be set free. The Minister of War at the time said, it doesn't matter what they did. What matters is their motive, which was patriotism. Therefore, they should go free. And it got to be to the point where, as I put this headline in here, there was such a feeling of identification with these great patriots, 9 boys, to mimic the 9 naval officers who were the chief plotters of this and the killers. Each cut off a finger and sent it to the war minister in solidarity with the seditionists and the murderers. So you can see things are starting to get a little crazy in Japan, a little bit fanatical. In 1936, there was actually a coup attempt. Officers murdered high officials from the palace, from the military, and also from the cabinet, and then hunkered down and said, we want a right-wing government. We insist that everybody resign. We want to put our people in, because we did all this for the emperor. And the emperor said, you are rebels, and you will surrender or you will die. And so most of the soldiers did surrender because they were just following orders. That's what they've been told to do. The ringleaders thought that they would get a show trial just like the previous one, and they'd be able to spout about their patriotism, bring people around to their point of view, hasten the right-wing totalitarian government that they wanted. And instead, the army put them against a wall and shot them, because even the army now was starting to get a little alarmed by things that were happening in their lower ranks. It was these young, hot-headed officers. This brings me to someone who's one of the most consequential figures of this era in Japan, and I'd be surprised if many of you knew who he was. His name is Prince Konoye Fumimaro. He was from a family of noble blood, popular in Japan. He was groomed to be the prime minister. He didn't really want it because he was a weak, pliable man, but the army realized that and installed him in 1937. Shortly after he was installed, there were a couple of shots exchanged by a Japanese patrol and a Chinese patrol at what's called the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing. It was a little small local incident. Everybody expected it to be contained and settled locally. But the Japanese military saw this as their chance, and they pumped it up, and they sent soldiers, and they turned it into the Second Sino-Japanese War, one of the most appalling wars of the 20th century, which most Americans know very little about. And Fumimaro, Prince Konoye, was behind that. War fever overtook Japan. Tens of thousands were conscripted. This is a typical young man with his family. They would decorate their house. They would spend much of their money on a feast, sake, rice for the neighbors, and then send them off with songs and cheers. War bonds became popular. Propaganda was pumped up. And pretty soon, the war got out of hand. Atrocities began. The Japanese began bombing civilians. This was new. It was appalling and outrageous for everybody. Although, of course, as we know, it became standard practice on both sides as the World War II went on. These two guys got press coverage during the war with China as the Japanese forces were heading towards Nanjing, because they had a contest going between them to see who could be the first to kill 250 Chinese using only a two-handed samurai sword. And the papers covered this like a sports contest. They stopped covering them after each of them had killed more than 100 Chinese, because it probably became obvious that the only people they were going to be able to kill using this method were Chinese civilians who were defenseless. So they sort of faded from the headlines. The army got to Nanjing in December 1937, took it, and everybody knows about the rape of Nanjing, one of the most horrifying atrocities of the 20th century. I don't know, 50 to 200,000 people, Chinese people, killed, at least 20,000 Chinese females of all ages raped. These next couple of photos are kind of hard to look at. They're from what happened in Nanjing when the Japanese entered the city. Meanwhile, at the same time, to try to avoid this, the gunboat, the USS Yangtze River, tried to avoid the conflict. They told the Japanese military where they were at every point. They had the Stars and Stripes flying from the mast. They had Stars and Stripes draped across the decks, and they had Stars and Stripes painted on the sides. Nevertheless, these guys aren't just going for a swim. As you can tell, the Japanese bombers came out of the sky, bombed them, strafed them, sank the boat. As the survivors tried to swim towards the reeds, they strafed the swimmers, and then Japanese army boats came up and strafed the boat again, went on board looking for survivors. So Grew thought that this was going to mean a declaration of war. It was clearly a violent, aggressive attack against an American gunboat, which was doing nothing. But they worked it out. Japan was appalled that the military had done this. The politicians worked it out. They paid compensation. They swore that it wouldn't happen again. And that was worth about as much as all the other Japanese promises that were made during the 1930s and early 1940s. One of the things I was surprised to learn was how provocative the Japanese military was against U.S. properties and people in Japan, not just the Chinese, but against properties. The open door, which you're probably familiar with, was a policy that was adopted by the Western powers, the US, Japan, and China, to allow commercial development in China, equal commercial development. So that's why there were a lot of American interests there. There were a lot of American missionaries there. The Japanese bombers and fighters would destroy US hospitals, US schools, US missions. They took over US houses. They began looting properties. They started monopolies that cut out American business people. And of course, Grew would protest every time these things were reported to him. By 1940, he kept a list. And by 1940, when the next foreign minister came in, because there was always a new one, he would hand him the updated list. About 1940, that list included more than 300 incidents that he had protested about bombings and confiscations and thefts and so on. Pretty amazing. On the other hand, this Japanese war was costing China dearly. This is a parade of soldiers, each carrying the remains, the ashes of a Japanese soldier, which were delivered to the family so that the family could grieve. This one always gets me. It's a young boy holding a photo of his father wrapped in black crepe, and behind him stands this soldier holding the remains of his father. By the late 1930s, Japan had 1 million soldiers in China, and there was virtually no house in Japan that had not contributed a son to this effort. It was very, very costly, this war. Japan lost between 2.5 and 5 million dead. No, I'm sorry, casualties, 500,000 to 700,000 dead in that war. The Chinese lost 4 to 10 million casualties, 2 million dead, and Chinese civilians, 10 to 20 million Chinese civilians were killed in that war. We hardly know anything about it. In 1939, in May, Drew took a furlough to Washington, and he met with the people he needed to meet with, including President Roosevelt. The two men knew each other from Groton and from Harvard. FDR had been 2 years behind Drew. They called each other Joe and Frank, but they weren't close. They were acquaintances who knew each other. And when Roosevelt took over in 1932, when he was elected rather in 1932, he wasn't sure that Frank, as he called him, had the stuff that was going to be necessary for the coming decade. He became a big admirer of Roosevelt's over the course of the 30s and the early 40s, and it was mutual. Roosevelt reappointed him over and over as ambassador. Drew also met with Secretary of State Cordell Hull, a very interesting character in this story. Hull was an expert on international trade, and yet he was tasked with running through these shark-infested diplomatic waters in the 1930s, early 1940s. He was a man of tremendously high principles, which could sometimes make him inflexible. And then Stanley Hornbeck, another one of the big players. He was Hull's main advisor for the Far East. He was what's called a China hand, and he had a strong dislike of the Japanese, which was problematic for Drew, as you can imagine. Well, Drew left to go back to Japan in late September 1939. A lot of things had happened while he had been at home. The Japanese had continued to bomb American properties and civilians, and so as a consequence, FDR abrogated the Commerce Treaty, which had made Japan a most favored nation in trade, and that treaty was going to end in January 1940. The Japanese were shocked. Why would you do that? Well, because we've been warning you we're going to do something, and you keep ignoring us. And so we finally did something. That held a big axe over Japan's head, because if we put tariffs on Japanese goods or charge them extra for goods that they needed, it was going to decimate their economy. The US was supplying much of the material that the Japanese were using to build their war machine, which became a huge political issue at home here too. The other thing that happened was that the Soviets and the Germans signed a non-aggression pact in August, betraying Japan, which had signed a pact with Germany against the communists. So July, the pact is signed, and we all know what happened on September 1st, 1939. Germany attacks Poland. A couple weeks later, the Soviets attack Poland from the other side. Well, not much happened. You probably heard of what's called the phony war. For the next 7 months, there wasn't a whole lot of activity really until April, when Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. And then by the middle of June, they had already swept across the Low Countries in France, and they were in Paris by the middle of June. So the reaction in Japan to this was ecstasy. They were ecstatic. This is what Japan wanted to do. Germany was wiping out the European powers, which left the colonies of the European powers ripe for taking by the Japanese. So they began looking around about what can we take next, and there was a craze for all things Nazi in Japan at this point. Germans started replacing English as the lesson on the radio, for instance. German songs started replacing American songs. That kind of thing started happening. In 1940, in July 1940, this is Prince Konoye up here at a costume party dressed as Hitler, because everybody wants to dress as Hitler, to go to a costume party. The army reinstalled him in 1940 in July, and he came in with a determination to establish one-party totalitarian political system and to join the Axis, and that's what he did. His new cabinet included someone very familiar to Americans, General Tojo, here on the right. And this was the Navy Minister Yoshida, who, a month or two later, had a nervous breakdown and went into the hospital because he could not persuade the Army to abandon its insane plans to provoke war with the Western powers. And then this fellow, Matsuoka Yosuke, the foreign minister, another one of the most consequential people of this era that most people have never heard of. Matsuoka was born poor in Japan, was sent to the United States at age 13 to make money, get an education. He lived in Oregon with an American family. He learned to speak English perfectly. He went to the University of Oregon, got a law degree there. Did I mention he converted to Christianity? He thought he knew America back and forth. He thought he knew everything about Americans. That was not apparent at all during the course of his tenure. He went to Germany because Hitler wanted to convince Japan to invade Hong Kong and Singapore at the same time that Hitler would invade Britain. Japan, however, and this was another surprising thing, I thought that these two countries were joined at the hip throughout this whole thing, but in fact, Japan had its own agenda, went its own way. For a long time, refused to connect itself to Germany's military plans. They said, we will do what we think is best for Japan. We're not going to say that we will attack anyone who attacks you. And they never did that. They never agreed to that. On the way back, Matsuoka made an agreement with Stalin to protect Japan's northern flank so that Japan could go south and start taking Southeast Asia. And that's exactly what they did. I think I might be getting a little too deep in the weeds here. This is a telegram that Gru sent in January 1941 about a rumor he heard that Japan was planning an attack on Pearl Harbor. This is January 1941. Gru thought it was crazy. But he passed it along. The State Department thought it was crazy, passed it along to the military, who had already, of course, considered this and decided it was crazy. 2 months earlier, Yamamoto had started the planning. The rumor was true. So here's just a couple of headlines about Japan's growing belligerence and its imperial ambitions. Matsuoka actually invited the U.S. to join the Axis Pact. He said that would be the best thing for everybody. If only FDR and Hitler and he could get together and figure out the future of the world. Britain was almost defeated, so why bother with them? It was a compelling argument for a while there. But at the same time, Japan was suffering dearly for its commitment to China, to the China War, and to the Southeast Asian campaign. So there was a lot of rationing. These are Tokyo taxis. They had been forced to convert to charcoal for their combustion because you couldn't get gas, oil, you couldn't get food. You couldn't get meat, fish. You couldn't get polished white rice. You couldn't get metal of any kind for house, things you needed for your house. You couldn't get clothing. Textile became impossible to find. Everything became impossible to find. And the military and the government kept telling the Japanese people, just hang on. They actually told the Japanese people, if you just can endure this for 10 years, Japan will be the top country in the world. And the Japanese were willing to do it because their emperor wanted them to. I'm going to go through this a little faster now so we can get to some questions if you all have any. Of course, where there's rationing and where there's shortages, oppression can thrive. And that became very common in Japan. This is a sign in front of an entrance to a neighborhood saying, anyone who has a permed hairdo can't come into our neighborhood. That was considered a Western extravagance. Men were not allowed to use hair oil, another Western extravagance. You're supposed to get a short military cut. Everything was devoted to the war effort. Nothing was allowed. Women weren't allowed to. If you wore lipstick, you would get confronted on the street. If men wore inexpensive watch, you would get confronted on the street. You weren't supposed to even, you're supposed to turn in your wedding bands, anything gold you had, to the Japanese government for the war effort. It was, we had some of the stuff that happened during World War II, as our parents have told us, but nothing like occurred in Japan. The restrictions and repression were in all aspects of society. English became verboten. If you spoke English on the street, you were risking arrest as a spy. They had to find new terms. They loved baseball. They didn't want to give up baseball, but they could no longer use the American terms like bunt and strike and foul ball. They had to find Japanese equivalents somehow for those things. That's how crazy it became. And of course, when you're under duress and you're trying to convince people that they are in danger, you have to create bogeyman everywhere. And so that bogeyman was the Western powers, in particular Britain and the United States. So the U.S. is plotting to ruin East Asia. These are typical headlines. The Anglo-Saxon plot to encircle Japan, a plan by these countries to take over Japan. This was all done to make the Japanese people angry, resentful, and afraid, so that they would do whatever the military asked them to do. Japan is the snake who's hatching the eggs. It's classic propaganda, and there was no way around it for the Japanese people, because they had one radio station, government owned, and all of the newspapers were controlled by the military. So there were no foreign news that contradicted anything that the military wanted was allowed into Japan. Grew was often appalled that even the leaders of the country had no idea what the military was doing, or what people in the United States were saying about what Japan was doing. They didn't believe that the United States would ever go to war, because they thought, according to their press, the United States was isolationist and the United States was soft, and they would never attack Japan no matter what Japan did. That's a big mistake. Okay, so I'm going to try to go ahead now. Togo. We're now up to the fall of 1941. Tojo became prime minister because of one of the most surprising things to me that I learned. When Konoye was still prime minister in late August, early September, he proposed a secret meeting with FDR to talk over what was going on, to try to find a way to head off war. Konoye swore to Grew that he was willing to make all sorts of concessions and to abide by them in order to avoid war. Konoye had become terrified that he had gotten his country into what was going to be a devastating future. And he didn't want that to be his legacy. His legacy was already the China War, which he was ashamed of. And he didn't want the same thing to happen with America. He had the military's agreement on this if they could come to an agreement with FDR. And of course, Grew was very excited by this prospect. And no Japanese prime minister had ever left Japan for any reason. And Konoye said, "I will meet you on American territory." That was another amazing concession. FDR was interested. He said, "Yes, let's talk more about this. And what do you think about it, Cordell?" Well, Hull smothered the idea in the cradle. It never happened. There would be people coming over to Grew's office almost on a daily basis from the foreign ministry saying, "Have you gotten a reply yet? Have you heard anything yet? Can we set a date yet?" And every time Grew had to say, "I don't have an answer for you. I can't get an answer out of them." Hull imposed so many preconditions against Grew's advice that the Japanese it was impossible for the Japanese to accept them. And for instance, get out of China before we'll talk. Well, you can't do that. That's not the way to have diplomacy or negotiations. So anyway, I should have mentioned that when the Nazis invaded Russia, It was a betrayal of Japan. It was a betrayal of the Axis agreement with Japan. And Grew once again thought this is a perfect opportunity for Japan to withdraw from the Axis. They have a reason now, and to come back towards the West. This is an opportunity for you to do that without losing any face. Instead, the Japanese went into southern Indochina. And that's when FDR froze Japanese assets in the United States. A month later, he embargoed oil. That was in August 1941. In September, there was this proposed meeting. By the middle of October, the United States had not responded. Conier's cabinet fell because the military said, this didn't work. We need to go in a different direction. And who comes in but Tojo as prime minister and minister of war. And so they began planning how to do that, how to go to war, when we're going to war. Now, the thing is that Hull and FDR knew all this because of the program called MAGIC. The United States had busted the diplomatic code of Japan. So FDR and Hull were reading all of the diplomatic traffic between Tokyo and Washington, Washington, Tokyo, Berlin, and Tokyo. They knew all the strategies that the foreign ministry were planning. They knew that the tactics. They didn't know what the military was doing, that they had not broken the military code, and none of that stuff was in the diplomatic traffic. All they knew was that Japan is saying one thing to us, and they're doing another thing in southern Indochina, so we can't trust them. It was a tremendous advantage to the U.S. Grew didn't know that we had that capability. Hull was afraid to let him know because he didn't know if Japan had broken our codes. And so he could not risk giving up this huge advantage just to let Grew know. So you had Grew on the ground, sensing things, talking to people and understanding things that Hull did not understand, but you had Hull getting this diplomatic traffic, and he understood many things much better than Grew did. This is Admiral Nomura. Nomura, he was the ambassador to Japan. He tried to quit over and over because he was disgusted and dismayed with what he was being told to do by his government. He was not allowed to quit. That brings us to December 7th. On the night before December 7th, Grew got a triple priority telegram he was supposed to deliver to the emperor. It was from FDR to the emperor saying, it looks to us, we have information that you are moving troops. It looks like you're planning something. We're the leaders of our countries. We should stop this now. It makes no sense for us to go to war with each other. Let's stop this. So Grew got this at midnight. It had been held by the army for 10 hours. Not that it mattered because everything was already underway, but Grew went to the foreign minister's office at midnight. The foreign minister agreed to deliver the telegram to the emperor, even though he knew what was going to happen in just a few hours. The next morning, Grew got up. He had a call from the foreign minister saying, come immediately, please. This was 7 o'clock in the morning. He went over there. The foreign minister handed Grew a statement that negotiations are broken off, but nothing else, no other indication of anything. Grew went back to the embassy, put on his golfing clothes, got ready to leave, and he heard the newsboys in the street saying, Japan declares war on the United States, bombs Pearl Harbor. That's how Grew found out. He and the embassy staff became prisoners of war in the embassy for 6 months. So we know how that happened and what it meant. Well, when Grew spent that 6 months of internment writing what he called his final report from Tokyo, which he was going to deliver to Hull and FDR as soon as he got back. It was 273 pages, I believe, or something like that. And he did deliver it. On the ship on the way home, he also wrote a 13-page cover letter to FDR, explaining some of his reservations and thoughts and analysis. When he gave the report to Hull, Hull started reading it and threw it back across the desk at Grew and told him to destroy every copy. Grew took out about 140 pages of that final report And he made sure to note in the document, which is in the Harvard library, in the group papers in the Harvard library, group put a note in, 143 pages have been excised at the request of the Secretary of State. He did not, however, destroy his letter to Roosevelt, which is in the file, the 13-page cover letter. And when he refers to his final report in that letter to Roosevelt, he writes in the margin, destroyed at Mr. Hull's request. So he was a good soldier. He did what he was told to do, but he wanted people to know there was something else here that you're not seeing. And that's sort of where my book comes from, because you can piece together what Grew thought by looking at all these dispatches, his 6,000 pages of diary that he kept in Tokyo, his speeches, his letters to friends and other people. You can piece together his memoirs. He's got 2 memoirs. You can piece together what he thought and how he felt at moments during his time there. And that's what my book is about. And that's why he was our man in Tokyo. I'm sorry I talked so long, and that's it. I'm going to get rid of this sharing the screen.
Okay, well, thank you, Steve. That was very interesting. And I'd like to open up the floor to questions. If anybody has any questions, you can put your video on if you want to gesture, or you can raise a hand to clap or something. But we're certainly open for questions right now. Do I have questions? Yes, Pam.
Yeah, I was just curious too. What was Ambassador Grew's relation with our U.S. Naval Attaché, Captain Smith Hutton? Because I had read that he was the one who actually informed Ambassador Grew that morning. He'd heard it over Radio San Francisco by shortwave before the Japanese confiscated everyone's transmitters, that Pearl Harbor had happened. So I'm just curious what was, because they knew the State Department codes except one, Grew knew that, were insecure, and the British were even listening, and the Germans. So, and even our naval attaché, everything went out by pouch. So I'm just curious, was there any interaction too with British intelligence at that point? What was going on?
I don't know if he had relationships with the British ambassador, a close relationship. Intelligence, I doubt it. Smith Hutton, yes, he was the naval attaché. I'm going by what Grew wrote in his diary at the time that it happened, and what he wrote in his memoir later. So if Smith Hutton claims that he's the one who told him, I guess we have competing versions. He's pretty. I trust Grew. He's not someone who toots his own horn or exaggerates much. So that's what I know, and which is true. I'm not. I wouldn't say.
Okay.
Carlos, you have a question. You have to turn your mic on, Carlos.
Yeah, just a quick question. Did he speak Japanese?
Do I?
Did
No.
Grew speak or read Japanese?
No, he did not. He spoke. I think he spoke about 4 languages pretty fluently, and he had smatterings of other languages. But when he got to Japan, he decided that the language is so complicated and intricate that he was terrified he would make some kind of horrible blunder and say something that was insulting. And it's a society that's highly attuned to manners and graciousness. And so he decided, no doubt wisely, that he would use interpreters when necessary. And often he didn't have to, because a lot of these people spoke English.
Thank you. Gary, you have a question.
Yes. So in, I think June or July of 41, there's this exchange between FDR and his and Ickes about with FDR claiming that in Japan there's some wrangling going on. There's some, fighting going on, whether or not they're going to quote unquote jump north or jump south.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that Richmond Kelly Turner, who was then in naval intelligence, was adamant that they were going to move against the Soviet Union in Siberia. And I think there was some other information. So I'm just wondering, did Giroux have any input on that particular, first of all, how is FDR aware of that? I imagine it could have been through the magic decrypts, but I'm wondering whether Giroux had any role to play in that, and what his what his viewpoint was in that respect. And I also just like to add that my feeling is that Roosevelt's real motivation at that point in time, when finally the oil embargo does go through, and then when he blows up the modus vivendi and whenever it was, the end of November, whatever, the days before Pearl Harbor, was not so, although he obviously had to be willing to risk war, was not necessarily to provoke war from Japan, but just to keep them looking south so that they would not indeed jump north and, pile on to the Soviet Union, which, at that time had yet to, halt the German Barbarossa offensive. So anyway, I just want you to know your thoughts about Giroux's involvement in any of that discussion, and just generally what I said.
Well, he was never involved in those discussions because he was too far away. It was not possible to do that really, but he had sent analysis to Hull previously that it was the Blue Water School and the Northern School, and the Army tended to want to go north and take Russia, and the Navy tended to want to go south and take Southeast Asia. And when this all came to a head, you're right, when the Nazis invaded the USSR, because it became necessary to choose. Hitler wanted the Japanese to come in on his side and attack the Russians from the east. And Matsuoka pushed that, but he was soundly defeated by the rest of the cabinet, including the military, because if the military had also gotten spanked a couple of times by the Russian army the Soviet army by this point, and they were not so sure that they were just going to that Germany was going to waltz through Russia. They did not believe that, and they also weren't so sure that they wanted to go north and fight the Soviet army when it'd be so much easier to go south and take this ripe fruit waiting to fall into Japanese hands. So that's what I know about that. Giroux had given his analysis about it to Hull, and I'm sure that was shared with FDR. And it was old news to Giroux, in other words, about June of 1941.
James.
Yeah, Steve, in my research of development with Vessel-class submarine, I see a lot of references to German equipment ending up in Japanese hands. Do you happen to know how they got sonars and radars and all kinds of stuff into Japanese hands?
Yeah, that was part of what Japan wanted from Germany was technology. That's one of the things that they wanted, and what Germany was hoping they would get back from Japan was a military commitment. And that was, I think the Japanese were more shrewd traders than the Germans were on that. So there was a lot of help and technology coming from Germany because Germany was basically courting the Japanese military. And a lot of the Japanese military wanted to do exactly what Hitler wanted them to do. They were resisted by the Navy, the Japanese Navy, for a long time, because it was the Army's plan and it was the Army's glory. And it was, if there was going to be a war in Asia, it was primarily going to be a naval war. And so the Navy was saying, let's think about this a little bit more. Although they didn't think about it very carefully, because every time they did a war plan, they lost. After a year and a half or so, Japan lost, and it's really enraging to read some of this stuff. Well, we did the war plan and we lasted a year, and then we ran out of everything and we had to quit. But let's make a plan anyway. That's constantly what the Navy did, and frustrating. I mean, it's amazing what fanaticism and delusion will do for your military planning.
Well, how did the equipment actually arrive? Did it arrive in the Middle East or?
Oh, I don't know that.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I can't help you with that.
Thank you.
Right. Go ahead, Bill.
Thanks, Vince. Steve, in your view, who had the most realistic view of the Japanese? Was it Grew on the ground in Japan, or was it Hull back in Washington?
That's a
good question.
really good question. And I think Grew had the most complete view. Hull had also a very true view, which is you can't trust them. Nothing they do is trustworthy. They're going to lie to us. Why should I believe anything they say? So that's what Hull looked at the Japanese, always through that lens. Let's expect deceit because that's all we ever get. And that's our, you can't really move anywhere diplomatically if that's your starting point. And I don't blame him. You can't blame the guy because he was right. That's the Japanese kept breaking their word. Grew kept saying they did break their word. Here's why they broke their word. I see a little opening here. Let me try this, because that's what a diplomat does. An ambassador is attempting to find common ground somehow to prevent the deterioration of the relationship. So I think Grew understood the Japanese far better than Hull did, but Hull understood them enough to know they weren't trustworthy, and maybe that's all he needed to know. The problem is that did get in the way of diplomacy sometimes. That meeting that Cornier wanted to have with FDR, I think was who knows what would have happened, if it would have mattered, if they would have come to an agreement, who knows? But Grew, because of what his personality is like, was let's try it. What do we have to lose? Let's try it. Hull's attitude was, why should we try it? They're just going to lie to us anyway. So what do you do with it? Where do you go with that? And he might have been right. And that's the thing.
I'm kind of curious myself. Did Grew have a sense that war was inevitable? I mean, in 1932, I would assume that he didn't, but
Yeah.
did that sense continue throughout his tenure there?
Well, I can tell you that what Grew answered, he was asked that very question in the Pearl Harbor hearings after the war, which were highly partisan. The Republicans were looking for Democratic scapegoats, and they tried to pin Grew down on this. You must have known war was inevitable way before it happened, right? And you were telling FDR and Hull, right? And Grew said, no, I never, ever believed war was inevitable. I couldn't believe that because my job was to stop it from happening. So right up to the end, I tried to do everything I could to prevent it. And so when he felt like a failure because the ambassador's first job is to keep the peace with his host country. And he started writing a memoir while he was there, his last year or so, and the title of the book was Failure of a Mission. And that's what he felt like, but he also felt like he had done everything he could.
That's the sense that I got from reading your book, but it's kind of an interesting follow-up to that is what would an ambassador in the form of Hull, somebody who didn't trust the Japanese at all, who was not open to Japanese culture, who was resistant to Japanese beliefs, what would somebody like that have done as ambassador? I'm curious. I know you can't answer that really, but do you think that would have precipitated war more quickly, perhaps?
I don't know, because Hull was he's an interesting character. He resisted the Hawks in FDR's cabinet for a long time, but he resisted partly because he wanted to continue trying to talk to the Japanese, but also because he didn't think the American people would accept war, and he also didn't think that the U.S. military was ready for war. So he wanted to delay that. So I think if he had been ambassador, he would have been a terrible ambassador because he wouldn't have been able to listen and reflect. He would have been, no, this is the way it is. This is what you must do. And that's the policy. That's what we want. And that was better, I think, as Secretary of State, although it did some damage there too. Hull, a lot of people really pile on Hull, and I can understand why, but he did keep talking to the Japanese for a long, long time. And it wasn't only to delay things so that the US military could catch up. It was also because he really did try to prevent the war with that last minute modus vivendi, for instance, that somebody mentioned. Although he abandoned that finally. I don't know if I answered your question.
I don't think the question really has an answer, but yeah,
He might have been more like Joseph Kennedy in Britain, I'm afraid. I don't know.
There
we
we
go.
go. Did Grew ever say what he thought a realistic settlement between the US and Japan would look like? I mean, for example, did Grew think it was realistic for the US to demand the Japanese withdrawal from China, or did he see some other sort of resolution that would have reconciled the two governments?
Well, there's two parts to that answer. One is when he's ambassador, and one is later on when he's working for the State Department at the time that the Potsdam stipulations are being formed. When he was ambassador, he thought it was impossible to get Japan out of China. He said he told Hull, the open door is over. We have to just admit that Japan needs China's raw materials, and they're not going to leave. Hi, Sharon. And so he advised Hull, don't make these demands that are impossible for China, for Japan to accept. Let's do it step by step. Let's try to get them out of Southeast Asia or out of North Indochina, or let's try to get them to stop attacking US properties. Let's take a piecemeal approach, and if they succeed at doing those things, then we can talk about the next thing, like maybe we can have a trade agreement again if you do this, this, and this. So Grew was always very practical and willing to take baby steps, whereas Hull was more like, I want to get it all done. And that's not what the way diplomacy works. Then later on, Grew was involved with figuring out how the terms for the Potsdam terms. And Grew told them, the Secretary of War and the other guy who was working on it, they'll never surrender unless we put in there that the emperor can survive as a position. Doesn't have to be Hirohito, but they will fight till the last child breaks the last stick on a US soldier's helmet. And so it's crazy if we don't put that in there. They didn't put it in. They did put it in, but by the time Truman got over there to Potsdam, we had dropped the test bombs at Alamogordo. There was no need to invade Japan anymore, and that clause was gone. So it wasn't in the Potsdam terms. Japan refused to surrender, drop the bomb, and then they said, okay, we'll surrender, but you have to let the emperor survive. That was still their condition to surrender. Grew got together with the Secretary of State, and they talked it over, and it was inserted in there vaguely enough that the emperor would be under MacArthur, essentially, and that's when they surrendered.
Thank you. I have Brian's question now, which has been transcribed, so let me read it for him. This is a bit off topic, but you mentioned the fighting in China, and Brian says, I've been recently doing some research on the plight of Allied prisoners of war held by the Japanese, and have found little regarding Chinese prisoners. For what I have found, the Japanese really didn't take Chinese military prisoners, and virtually no Chinese prisoners were released at the end of the war. Chinese prisoners were just summarily executed. And he's curious, do you have any information on this?
No, I don't. All I can say is I'm not surprised to hear that. I think that's, and by the way, I doubt there were any Japanese prisoners of war either in China.
On the Chinese side, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, do we have any last chance if you guys have any more questions?
Vince, Don Patton.
Don.
This is probably way off base.
Nothing's off base, Don. Nothing's off base with you.
But one of the things the reason I think, and again, I am not a historian, I'm just a historian organizer, if I can leap that. But I always try to look at the importance of history as a learning tool. And if you look at the 30s, the rise of Nazism, and I just met with some German scholars to discuss that. But the events that you've discussed here today, do you see any parallels to what's going on with Russia and Ukraine, and lessons to be learned, parallel behaviors of either side?
Yeah, that's a big, I mean, there's always lessons to history, and there's parallels if you try to make them too exact, because they're not, but there are cycles of similarities that keep happening. There's the totalitarian playbook. It never changes. It was used in Germany, in Italy, in Japan, Putin. It's being used in Hungary. It's being used in the United States, frankly, these days by some people. So yes, there are parallels, there are lessons, and I wish people would learn the lessons. There are certain things that you can see it coming a mile away. Some of these things, you shut down the media, you make the media state media, you make the enemy a demon, you scare them, you keep them from knowing what's really happening, what you're really doing in the war zone. I mean, all these things. You attack the people who try to tell the truth. You replace truth and facts with conspiracy theories and paranoia and hatred. You use nativism to rouse people, to convince them that they are in danger of extinction, that there was a good old day, there were good old days, and we need to go back to the Russian Empire, and we need to go back to make America great again. We need to go back to, China's another example. I mean, China is using the Japanese playbook in Asia now. Some of the same things that Japan did at the time, it's happening. So I'm not going to step into those waters too deeply because they're too controversial. But yes, you can always learn from history.
That was a good answer, actually. Well, I thank everybody for coming. I think this was a very interesting presentation. It's a little bit different than what we normally do. Not so naval centric, but I think we benefit from that. So I thank you very much, Steve, and you're welcome to participate in our groups, going forward if you're so inclined. And we really appreciate you sharing the results of all your efforts and your work. I did pick up a copy of the book, and it's kind of blood curdling what was going on in Japan back in those days. It makes for sometimes for some fairly difficult reading, but at least it's well written and it flows, Steve. So I have to say that much.
Oh, thank you.
It is very well written. So thank you once again. And I appreciate everybody coming this morning or this afternoon. And you can get back to the March Madness games now. So thank you very much.
Thanks for setting it up, Bill. And thanks for letting me do it, Vince.
Oh, no, my pleasure.
Okay.
You are our reward. So thank you.